Assalamualaikum, my dear students. This is Shaila Akhtar, Assistant Professor English. Today I'm here again with an online class for the students of Honours 4th year, and we are going to discuss a poem written by Emily Dickinson from American Poetry, and the title of the poem is I Felt a Funeral in My Brain. Let's have a look on the life sketch of Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson was born on December 10, 1830 in a small American town called Amherst. The population of this town hardly numbered 3,000, and this town was situated in the center of a huge semicircle of hills, and this town was considered as a beauty spot in the Connecticut River Valley. Her father, Edward Dickinson, was a lawyer, a congressman, and a trustee and treasurer of Amherst College. Emily was educated at home except for a year, 1847, at Mount Holyoke Female Seminary at South Hadley, and this institution was hardly 10 miles from Amherst. Emily was considered as an eccentric by the locals. She developed a penchant for white clothing and was known for her reluctance to greet guests, or later in her life to even leave her bedroom. Dickinson never married, and most friendship between her and others depended entirely upon correspondence. While Emily Dickinson was a prolific writer, her only publications during her lifetime were 10 of her nearly 1800 poems and one letter. The poems published then were usually edited significantly to fit conventional poetic rules. Her poems were unique to her era, and they contain short lines, typically lack titles, and often use slant rhymes and unconventional capitalization and punctuation. Many of her poems deal with themes of death and immortality, two recurring topics in letters to her friends, and also explore aesthetics, society, nature, and spirituality. Emily Dickinson died on May 15, 1886 at Amherst. This is the most famous portrait of Emily Dickinson. Okay, now we can start our poem. I felt a funeral in my brain, and a theme of this poem is mental suffering because of the thought of death. As we know that Emily Dickinson was always preoccupied with the theme of death. So the image of a funeral taking place in the writer's brain and is an image of mental trauma. And in this poem, the narrator is not simply imagining a funeral that she is viewing and hearing from a distance. Rather, it feels literally and as if a funeral is occurring in her head, on her brain, and the poet thinks that she herself is the dead person. So the poem contains a disturbing portrayal of death and a terrible struggle that the separation of the body from the soul gives rise to during the death. And here we have emphasis on dying sensation and failing powers because of death. And in this poem, the poet gives emphasis on death's dreadful isolation, and no hope of immortality or resurrection is shown by the poet in this very poem. The poem I Felt a Funeral in My Brain is a very short and concise poem of 5 quatrains, and the very first stanza or first quatrain is here. I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading till it seemed that sense was breaking through. So the images and the thoughts we can get from the first stanza are: there is an exposed body, dead body before the funeral, and the mourners are walking past the body. The steps of the mourners became a heavy treading to the tortured consciousness of the dead, and this sense continues until the dead felt its sensations ceasing. So the scene begins with the mourners walking past the exposed body before the actual funeral service begins, and the atmosphere is oppressive, and incessant treading of feet seems physically to torment to the brain of the dead person. So the subdued state of mourners in the real world became a heavy, insistent treading to this tortured consciousness, and until it feared that sense was breaking through, or it is ceasing eventually. So until the complete cessation of the feeling of the dead body, this feeling of numbness continues. Here the second stanza, and the stanza is: and when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating till I thought my mind was going numb. Now let's see what is the information we can collect from the second stanza. In the second stanza, we have the picture of beating drum, which creates or influences our sensation of hearing. So we have the use of onomatopoeia here. So beating drum is a pagan ritual of burial, and when the funeral service began, the continuous humming sound made the mind of the dead numb, and the formality of the ceremony penetrates the soul also, and the throbbing drums induce a drugged weariness. So the mourners are seated and the funeral begins in the mind or in the thought of the poet, because in the very beginning stanza we have the lines like, I felt a funeral in my brain. So everything is happening in the brain of the writer. So the formality of the ceremony penetrates the soul like throbbing drums to induce a drugged weariness. So everything is actually happening in the brain of the poet, and she is thinking of herself as a dead one. So when the funeral service began, its incessant droning or humming sound is making the mind actually begin to go numb, though with the disquieting echo of a pagan ritual in its beating drum. So this sound, this echoing sound actually is not giving peace in the mind of the or in the brain of the dead body. Here is the third stanza of the poem. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again, and space began to toll. The third stanza of this poem describes the time when the coffin is closed and is carried to the grave. And here the poet says, when the coffin is closed with lead bolts, the soul was trampled and collapsed. Then the coffin is carried to the church, and the sound of the lead boot soles of the attendants hurts the consciousness as the procession leaves the church, and this sound thrusts her or the feeling of the dead body into space or infinity. So actually in the third stanza, bolts of lead trample across the dead body's soul as the coffin is closed and carried to the church. Then space began to toll, and the bells sounding in the background temporarily thrust the dead person into infinity or into space or into the state of nothingness. So by the time the third stanza is reached, the mind is so dissociated that it is now both the extinct life in the coffin and the agonist soul across which the pallbearers creak. The line with those same boots of lead again implies that the experience was reenacted over and over, yet simultaneously with the lead of the coffin transferred to the boot soles of the attendants. The fourth stanza of the poem. As all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear, and I and silence, some strange race, wrecked solitary here. In the fourth stanza, the tension increases as the body is carried to the grave. The funeral knell sounds announcing the death of the body of agony, and the bell with its cosmic sound kills the listening spirit of the dead and other sensations. So the consciousness is wrecked and left solitary, accompanying only silence. So this sound is so cosmic that only the most extravagant simile will describe it, that is, as all the heavens were a bell and the being but an ear. So such a climax has an absolute rightness about it, and with this final tolling, the consciousness is wrecked solitary, except for the accompanying silence, which is more harrowing than any of the sounds had been. So here the tension increases actually as the body is carried to the grave, and the bells obliterate all other sensations, casting the soul upon eternity itself, but without hope of resurrection. So actually the poet is he is trying to sum her poem up to the feeling of numbness, and the very ending point gives us an information where the dead body actually left alone with silence, and she is left alone by consciousness also, because there is no hope of resurrection, there is no sign of consciousness, and there is no sign of hope. The last or final stanza. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down and down, and hit a world at every plant, and finished knowing then. In the fifth stanza, the poet describes, with the coffin about to be lowered into the grave, the speaker or the poet who is describing the feeling of being a dead body dropped down through the level after level of unconsciousness. A plank in reason broke at every crash, and it reached a world of extinction or nothingness and created the last soundless sounds of agony, and being swallowed up in the trance or extinction was the cause of that agony. So being left in eternal silence is harrowing, obviously. So this total circumstance gives us a feeling of horror and despair. Reeling under these continual blows, the soul experiences complete disintegration with the tumbling of the casket into the grave, and the words finished knowing complete the loss of conscious control as the soul moves into the irrational unknown, into an indifferent universe where nobody is there to think about the dead body, and where the dead person actually has no power or no feeling to feel something or to do something. The poem I Felt a Funeral in My Brain actually describes a kind of sense of despair. The emphasis on dying sensations and failing powers suggests death's dreadful isolation. On another level, the initial phrase in my brain hints that this physical death represents some terrible emotional pain or loss that brings an overwhelming sense of despair. And since the soul has lost its reason for living, the person ceases to exist. And this very poem, the poet describes about some knowledge of the absolute. That means the soul gains a temporary insight into the infinite, according to some critics. Here, death symbolizes this, and since it is one of the few crucial experiences that reveal a glimpse of final things, this critic concludes that the poem combines both triumph and failure, for man must return to reality after breaking through the barriers of sense into infinity. This is all for today. We will be together with another class very soon. Till then, stay home, stay safe. Thank you.